Good morning. I'll be reading out of Exodus chapter 16. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the sixth day they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us?" Moses also said, "You will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses told Aaron, "Say to the entire Israelite community, 'Come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling.'" While Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked forward toward the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. The Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." That evening quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Everyone is to gather as much as they need. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent." The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some little. And when they measured it by the omer, the one who had gathered much did not have too much, and the one who had gathered little did not have too little. Everyone had gathered just as much as they needed. Then Moses said to them, "No one is to keep any of it until morning." However, some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept part of it until morning. But it was full of maggots and began to smell, so Moses was angry with them. Each morning everyone gathered as much as they needed, and when the sun grew hot, it melted away. On the sixth day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person. And the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. He said to them, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake, and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left, and keep it until morning." So they saved it until morning, as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. "Eat it today," Moses said, "because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any of it on the ground today. 6 days you are to gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will not be any." Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather it, but they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That is why on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the 7th day. No one is to go out." So the people rested on the 7th day. The people of Israel called the bread manna. It was white like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. This is the word of the Lord.
So it's a long passage this morning. I'm not going to read parts of it back, but the reason I wanted to have the whole section read is just to give you the context of what was going on with the Israelites at the time, right? Because it's important to understand kind of where they were, what they were experiencing as we talk about Sabbath in the context of liberation. Before we get into it, though, just want to mention that our Bible study, our summer Bible study, wrapped up, and I thought it went pretty well. I was excited for the 5 weeks we were able to do that. I also realized 5 weeks in a row, kind of a lot. And so for the fall, the plan is to do actually Wednesday nights. There'll be more about this soon, but we'll be shifting to Wednesday nights because I have a class on Thursdays. So we're going to be shifting to Wednesday nights, and it'll be the second and fourth Wednesdays of the month as opposed to every single week. And we're going to be in the book of Ruth together. It's a shorter book, but I think it'll be really good to kind of have time in the Old Testament as we on Sundays spend time in Acts starting in the fall. So that's just a heads up on what's happening. Second and fourth Wednesdays, it'll be about 6 studies total with the holidays kind of baked in there. So just a heads up there. All right, well let's get into the word this morning, but let's say a quick prayer before we get in. God, thank you so much for your word this morning. Thank you for being the liberator of Israel, bringing them out of slavery. And Lord, open up your scripture to us that we may learn what you have for us, especially as it relates to Sabbath. So thank you, Lord. We look forward to hearing from you this morning. Amen. So imagine with me that you are the Israelites leaving Egypt. Just witnessed some truly incredible things. An entire body of water was literally divided in two for your people to walk through. Not only did Pharaoh finally let you leave after 10 plagues, but the Egyptians gave you their gold, their silver, their precious metals on your way out. The most powerful army in the world was chasing you, but this God that Moses keeps talking about saved you. But that all seems like a distant memory now. Now you're stuck in the desert where there's no food and you don't have a home anymore. Sure, God brought water for rock the other day, but what does he really want with you? Why are we out here? Freedom and leaving Egypt seemed like a really good idea at the time, but is it really any better out here? It's been 1 month since you left Egypt, and you kind of miss it. The only home that you've ever known. Sure, you had to work a lot, and you were treated horribly, but at least you knew what to expect. Being a slave was rough, but at least you'd figured out how to survive, how to scratch by, how to live another day. Freedom brought too many choices, too many decisions to have to make. You know how to work hard, but that's about all you know because that's all you were allowed to do. You didn't know or care what you were working for, just that the work always had to be done. Make as many bricks as you can before you're allowed to go home and collapse into bed. Life was simple. Freedom wasn't on the table. It wasn't an option. Pharaoh was all-powerful, and there was no way he was going to let us go, so why bother thinking about freedom at all? Just focus on making bricks as quickly, as efficiently as possible so you can go home. Friends, this is the background and the mindset into which God introduced Sabbath. Ceasing from work. Moses might as well have told them to stop breathing because working to survive was all that they knew. For 400 years, their lives were defined by endless toil. 7 days a week, the assembly line didn't stop. The brick quotas never ended. Pharaoh never let up. If you don't work, you don't eat. It's that simple. And it's into this harsh reality that through Moses, God invited his people into rest. The author of Exodus emphasized that Sabbath was liberation from Pharaoh's slavery. But it's no wonder that the Israelites couldn't and wouldn't believe it. It's not easy to let go of lies, is it? Especially when they're so deeply ingrained in us. Work defined these people. And it's fair to assume, I think, that they probably got pretty good at brick making over those generations. Maybe it even became a point of pride how well they could make bricks. Now, deep down, I'm sure they knew it was empty and that they were prisoners, but they had learned to survive under these very harsh circumstances. But now they're out in the desert, and they're free, but they didn't have an identity anymore. They weren't sure what to do with themselves. There were no bricks to be made. There's a lot of downtime in the desert, and they were getting restless. Now, strange as this may sound, they might have missed working, right? At least it gave them something to do. But they also found that their bodies were recovering. They were getting to sleep more, spend more time with their families. Their children didn't have to do back-breaking work. Their grandchildren didn't have to do back-breaking work. So maybe not working wasn't so bad. And it's taking time to adjust, to detox from working all the time, but it gets a little easier every day. It's been a month, starting to kind of get used to it. Now, they still were not 100% sure about this God because he was terrifying. But he certainly seems different from Pharaoh. See, Pharaoh acted like a god too, but he didn't care about us at all. He only cared about how many bricks we could make. But this God isn't making us do anything at all. Well, most of our situations are not nearly as dire as what the Israelites were escaping. I would venture to guess that many of us know what it's like to feel measured by our production, by our work. Preston was actually telling me the other day about a performance system that some financial institutions use that rank people based on their productivity. And if you're not, and so then what happens is that some arbitrary percentage of the bottom performers get periodically laid off, right? I mean, talk about literalizing the notion of treating people as commodities. It's treating people as things, as just worker bees. They're not even trying to hide it with this kind of system. And this is brazen evidence that Pharaoh's system of oppression and commodification is very much alive and well today. See, this gig economy that we're told about is loaded with the perception of endless opportunities for side hustles where anyone can get rich. But it's used to rationalize cutting salaries and slashing benefits. Social Security is uncertain. Pensions are disappearing. Having to work more years for less money is becoming a reality for more and more people. All the while, undocumented immigrants are exploited for cheap labor, and then they're deported when they're no longer serving their purpose. Their economic purpose, of course. In the midst of Pharaoh's exploitative system today, Exodus emphasizes that Sabbath liberates us today from Pharaoh's enslavement. All empires exploit people and natural resources for power. You can draw a straight line from Pharaoh's Egypt to the American empire today. Empires throughout history have much in common. They all have bloodlust for power and money, and will use and abuse anyone and anything to spread their influence and extend their reign of power. But just as God ushered the freed Hebrews into a new kind of kingdom with a new kind of king, he invites us today out of bondage to American consumerism into this kingdom of liberating rest. And God makes the grand pronouncement in Scripture: Sabbath is the weekly act of resistance against empire and the liberating act that brings heaven to earth. So this morning we're going to talk about how Sabbath liberates us from slavery to production, from slavery to consumption, and from slavery to self-reliance. Sabbath liberates us from fruitless production, from endless consumption, and from the illusion of human independence. In each point, we're going to see how Pharaoh exploited people in creation. We're going to see how American culture exploits people in creation. And then how God's liberated people should love people and nurture creation. Love people and nurture creation. So let's start with what is probably the most obvious thing about Sabbath, which is that it liberates people from production. As Sam preached last Sunday, Sabbath is primarily about ceasing work. I imagine every sermon in this series will touch on ceasing work because that is at the heart of Sabbath. For the Israelites, ceasing work was an absolutely radical idea. right? For 400 years, they were defined by their work. And it was all that they were allowed to do. To stop working as an Egyptian slave meant starvation. It meant death. Not only for you, but for your entire household. In Pharaoh's kingdom, rest for slaves meant lost revenue, lost time, and making room for potential resistance from the oppressed. And so Pharaoh made the Hebrews work and work and work, and he punished them severely for missing brick quotas. You want your children to have food? Better hit your quota. You want your aging parents to have water? Better hit your quota. See, endless toil was the only way of life that they knew. So God coming in all of a sudden and saying that they need to stop working, it doesn't compute. It doesn't make any sense to them. Ceasing wasn't in Pharaoh's vocabulary. Like some of you, my parents were immigrants to this country. But contrary to popular myths, America doesn't necessarily open its borders for everyone. Those who are allowed in are not so subtly expected to work and to work hard to earn the privilege of living in America. And so my parents worked, like some of your parents, like some of your grandparents. And at multiple points in their lives, and for much of my life, they worked 10-hour days, 7 days a week. So the grind was very real for my parents. They had to overcome language barriers, racism, and the changing role of technology in society. For immigrants, work, almost by necessity and for survival, becomes their priority and their identity. For my parents, taking a day off once a week would have been a true luxury. I mean, for better or worse, they didn't take many days off for many years. A common but deceptive argument we hear from some politicians is that migrants or immigrants are coming here to take advantage of the welfare system or to look for handouts, or that black people are lazy and don't want to work. Political inventions such as the welfare queen and other similar racist, sexist, and xenophobic rhetoric became convenient narratives to buttress America's meritocratic myths about hard work always paying off. The recent Supreme Court decision to eliminate affirmative action is pretty clear evidence that the myth of meritocracy, among other delusions, is alive and well. Meanwhile, those at the top of America's companies continue to profit off those very same black and brown people's under market wages. By instituting regular rest from work for his people, God declared that his kingdom is nothing like Pharaoh's. His kingdom is nothing like America's. In God's kingdom, value is not found in productivity, but in being God's beloved. In God's kingdom, power is not propped up by exploiting vulnerable people, but by protecting them. The orphans, the widows, the immigrants. This is the trio we see throughout the Old Testament. As the good king, God is not interested in profiting off of your labor. He doesn't need your money. God's bottom line isn't affected when you take Sabbath off. In fact, God's economy is qualitatively different from Pharaoh's, from America's. In empires where exploitation is the norm and greed is considered good, God says, look out for your neighbor's interests, not your own. In a social media culture that breeds addiction through the fear of missing out, if you ever were to unplug, God says it's okay to be bored sometimes and just be still. It's okay to be bored. In God's kingdom, we are liberated from the chains of productivity. That doesn't mean we don't work hard or that we're lazy. I would say quite the opposite. It means we work hard when it is appropriate to work hard, because God entrusted us to steward creation, and that includes working hard. But we also stop working when it is appropriate, because that is part of stewarding creation well too. Ceasing work is part of spreading God's kingdom just as much as working diligently is. This isn't true just for individuals, right, for each of us. Remember that God is instituting a new kingdom, right? A new society. He is reintroducing Eden with the Israelites. God will dwell with them, they will be his people, and these people will spread the good news that God is the great liberator. So when we stop working, that means we make space for rest for others in our spheres of influence. See, later in Exodus, we see that Sabbath isn't only for people, but it's for animals, it's for the land. So when we stop working, everything gets its God-given rest too. This isn't just about us. God cares about everything. For those of us with spouses or children, when we cease, you are removing some of the effects of labor and toil from their lives too. For those of us who are managers or supervisors or business owners, one of the best things you can do for your direct reports or for your employees is to cease work. Do you realize that when you are enslaved to productivity, you enslave your direct reports, your family members, and your friends? Because they often are the ones who will suffer before you'll even feel it. Because if you won't stop sending emails late at night, how can they stop working? If you don't close your laptop, put the phone down at night, you're showing your kids this is what Christians do. If you don't have time for your friends because you're working all the time, you're showing your friends that Christians are no different from the rest of this productivity-addicted world. And this is why ceasing work on Sabbath is so incredibly difficult. Many of us have built years of bad habits based on lies that we've swallowed that work defines us. Now, don't get me wrong. Obviously, we need to work to pay the bills. And that's a much harsher reality for some of us than others. So I'm not saying hard work is not important. But when we don't cease work in the ways that are good and healthy for our circumstances, we feed the beast and we become part of the problem. When we don't cease work regularly, we play our part in Pharaoh's oppressive system that commodifies people and exploits creation. And because our society is so fueled by productivity, when we cease, boy, does it stand out. People notice. Our opting out of grind culture will draw attention. So when our older daughter, Jojo, was a baby, Crystal and I made some decisions in our lives to prioritize time with her. Now, I realize this is a huge luxury that most people don't have. It's because we have grandparents nearby who could help out, and we were in a financial position to slow down. But at the time, I remember having a lot of conversations with people about how I got comfortable saying no to new opportunities. I said no to ministry opportunities. I said no to potential new work. I said no to new responsibilities. There were absolutely times when I felt guilty, where I was afraid that I'd fall behind in my career. But as I practiced saying no, I got more comfortable saying no. In God's kingdom, we are liberated Sabbath people. Because our value is not wrapped up in our productivity, we can say no without fear that our careers will tank, or that our livelihoods will be ruined, or that our peers will pass us up, because who cares if they do? Just like I got more comfortable with saying no over time, learning to live free from the bondage of productivity takes time, and it takes practice, and it takes messing up. The Israelites were free people for just 1 month before they started grumbling against Moses and God, as we saw in our passage. See, people are super stubborn, and we learn very, very slowly. But as we practice Sabbath together, our bodies and our healthier relationships will tell us that ceasing is good and that ceasing is right. So what that means is that you should say no more often, even if that means saying no to me if I ask you to serve in some way. It's really okay. This is a word especially for those of us who are people pleasers. It's okay to say no. It's especially okay to say no when saying no will make margin for your life for Sabbath rest and for being present to God and to other people. It's okay to say no. So let's practice that this week. See, I'm going to be on vacation, so you can't say no to me. So, all right, productivity is on one side of the economic equation, and consumption, of course, is on the other. Sabbath also liberates us from enslavement to consumption. While productivity and consumption are often connected, we each struggle with them differently, right? For example, some of us just really like working and are addicted to working, but not necessarily because we want the money so we can buy and accumulate stuff with what we make. We just enjoy work. That's not a bad thing. I like my work. But likewise, others of us don't like work very much, And judging by the stats that Sam shared last week, about 75% of us don't like work very much. That's a lot of us. But we may enjoy buying and accumulating. And Exodus speaks a word to both of these groups. In Pharaoh's empire, the Israelites probably didn't have much consumer freedom, right? As you can imagine, they were slaves. As slaves, they ate the food they were given, wore the clothes that they were given, lived where they were placed. And yet there is plenty of evidence throughout human history to suggest that there was probably still competition over status, even in enslaved people, over who got supervisory roles, who managed to create innovative dishes with these meager ingredients that they were given. When resources are scarce, there may have been a tendency to hoard and to squirrel away. You know, I've noticed among friends of ours who are children of immigrants that our parents tend to hoard things and not throw stuff away or donate them, because you never know when you'll need that thing, right? In the case of my parents, they'll wear out their clothes before switching them out. Even when we bought them perfectly new clothes to wear, they will keep wearing that ratty t-shirt. And after thinking about it, I don't blame them, because they had to scrimp and they had to save for many, many years. I can see why it would be hard to throw away a perfectly good shirt, even if it has a few holes in it. But I would say the larger American culture has the opposite problem. Everything is treated as disposable and replaceable, right? Fast fashion means cheap clothes that can be replaced every season without any thought to the natural resources that are getting burned up and consumed, and the landfills that are piling up with cheaply made clothes. Or about how clothes this cheap, we don't think about how they can be this cheap, because we don't want to think about child labor. We don't want to think about exploited workers in poor countries. They're not advertising that stuff when the sales are happening, are they? Our consumer habits can take a toll on creation and on the vulnerable. More online purchases mean more delivery trucks, means more exhaust fumes. This is Pharaoh's economy of exploiting workers and creation to make bricks for taller buildings or to exploit commodities for profit. This is the American empire chugging on, regardless of all the warning signs that our consumer habits are pushing our planet toward extinction. This reminds me of the scene in The Lord of the Rings, the Two Towers movie, if you have seen it, when the wizard who goes bad, his name's Saruman, starts production of his orc army. I apologize if I'm losing you with this. But the camera pans over the land. His area was called Isengard, okay? It was this lush land. When he starts making this army, what they show what happens is fire everywhere. There's huge holes that were dug to dig up natural resources. Everything is on fire. All the trees have been cut down, and these beasts are making weapons of war. This is what happens to the land. A visceral and memorable depiction of what consumption run amok looks like. When power is being grasped, people in creation become disposable means to evil ends. But we see a very different picture painted in Exodus 16, and this is why I wanted Paul to read the whole passage. Because in God's kingdom, out-of-control consumption has no place. In verse 16, the Israelites were told to gather what they needed, not as much as they wanted. There was plenty for everyone, but that didn't entitle anyone to take more than they needed. God could provide everything, but yet he said, just take what you need. See, because greed is antithetical to God's kingdom. Hoarding is antithetical to God's kingdom. In God's kingdom, our consumption has good limits and healthy boundaries. If it wasn't clear enough, Exodus makes the warning pretty literal. Anything you keep beyond what you need will rot. See, some of the Israelites, probably in that scarcity mindset, right? Makes sense that it was nurtured in Egypt. They needed to squirrel it away because they weren't sure, is God's manna really going to come the next day? They tried to keep some of it for the next day, even though they were explicitly warned not to, because maybe they didn't trust that God would provide. And what happened? They woke up to maggot-infested manna the next morning. When we hoard, when we try to take more than what we need, what we squirrel away rots, and it destroys us along with it. Because we don't stop exploiting and consuming The land suffers greatly like an Isengard. God commanded Sabbath for the land too. God gives the land time to heal and to be restored. The God who created all things, the God of abundance, gives generously, but he does not give to the point of gluttony and excess. Greed is not rewarded because those who tried to gather more and those who tried to gather less both had what they needed. Did you catch that in the passage? They both had what they needed. See, Jesus warned against hoarding too, in case you thought this stopped in Exodus. In Luke chapter 12, verses 16 to 21, Jesus tells the parable of the rich fool. And he says, "The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. And he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops.' Then he said, 'This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns. I'll build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?' This is how it will be with whoever stores things up for themselves, but is not rich toward God." See, Jesus condemns this behavior of hoarding for oneself. Because think about how generous this rich person could have been with his grain for the orphans, for the widows, for the immigrants, for the poor in his community. All this brings us to Sabbath. For 5 days, God instructed the Israelites to gather only what they needed for that day, but on the sixth day, he told them to gather 2 days' worth. No gathering on the Sabbath. You'll have what you need. For those who hoarded in previous days, imagine, right? If they had to deal with maggots, you would remember that. Wouldn't you think if you were them who had hoarded previously, like, oh man, are we really supposed to gather more than we needed? Because I remember what happened last time, and it stunk in here. I know I'd be scared, be thinking, what if God's tricking us? But the Israelites learned about God's true nature on the morning of that seventh day. God provided, and they didn't have to lift a finger. They didn't have to go out and gather it. They didn't have to work for their food on the seventh day. They learned to trust God. They learned to trust God on that first Sabbath day. They observed Sabbath without, in fact, even knowing it, because Sabbath wasn't instituted in the Ten Commandments until Exodus 20, right? And we read Exodus 16. See, this is why. Because the blessing of Sabbath came before the rule did. The blessing of Sabbath came before the rule did. Just like we saw in Genesis a couple weeks ago, Sabbath was a gift before it was a rule. So how do we observe Sabbath in a consumer-driven culture? What does it look like for us to be liberated from consumption and to cease greed and hoarding? What does that practically look like? It's going to sound super obvious. Consume less on the Sabbath. Consume less on the Sabbath. Spend less money. Reduce your entertainment, especially on screens, which are so often designed to extract things from us. Maybe drive less to give creation a break. Reconnect with your body and with creation. Be mindful of how your consumption is directly connected to making someone else work on the Sabbath. So if you do go out to eat, that's okay. If you go out to eat, tip generously, please. Be kind to the workers. If you watch something on the Sabbath, it's also okay. Make sure you have a conversation with somebody after, not just endlessly binging things and passively taking these things in. Do something that engages your body in creative and generative ways, and do it in community. Do it in community. Limit your commercial activities to give even the tiniest bit of rest to our economy that is just always go, 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 and feeding off of us. And disciple yourself away from consumeristic habits on that one day. Be mindful of others, too, who may have less materially or relationally than you on the Sabbath. Be neighborly and be inclusive on the Sabbath. Invite someone to lunch who's new to our church or new to Chicago, or give a call to someone who moved away and hasn't found community yet. Or maybe somebody here in this room who is lonely. There are simple ways that we can resist consumerism. and liberate others from consumerism on the Sabbath. Finally, the Sabbath liberates us from self-reliance. Productivity and consumption contribute to the illusion that we are in control. They push the narrative that if we work hard enough for long enough, and if we save enough for long enough, we'll be insulated from pain and suffering. That somehow having enough stuff, enough things to entertain us, will somehow distract us from having to deal with difficult things. I believe some of us resist Sabbath because we don't like feeling out of control. One of the most common things that happen when you start observing Sabbath, you start feeling kind of icky and out of sorts. I don't know if any of you can relate to this, but this happens to me beginning of almost every Sabbath. I don't typically sleep well the night going into Sabbath. And there's going to be a quote up here in a second. This is from Ruth Haley Barton, and I just think she puts this really well. It kind of nails my addiction to work perfectly. Oh, it's a little small, sorry, but I'm going to read it. It says, when we first start practicing the Sabbath, we might not always experience this peace and serenity right away, or even every time. The first thing we might experience is the discomfort of discovering how addicted we are to human striving and hard work. We might discover that we do not even know who we are when we are not working. As we unplug from our normal ways of being connected, we might experience intensifying feelings of angst or fear of missing out, or we might be ambushed by emotions we've kept at bay by staying so distracted and busy. This is all very normal. Most of us will encounter some of these inner dynamics from time to time, making Sabbath feel anything but peaceful. But after 20 years of practice and learning to wait through the initial discomfort, my experience now is that this peace, this tranquility, this shalom descends more quickly as I unplug and power down, trusting my weary soul to God. Given the stresses and strains that are part and parcel of life in a fallen world, what God does in and through my feeble attempts to try and enter in is a wonder each and every time. This encapsulates literally every Friday for me when I take Sabbath. Sabbath rest confronts us with the best and the worst parts of ourselves because we have space to sit in it. And it's not always fun, I assure you it is not always fun, but it is always good. It's always good. And as Haley Barton says, the more we do it, the more deeply we sink into God's peace. On a weekly basis, we detox from worshiping ourselves. We are purged of our self-reliance, of our striving, of our human tendencies to think that we can overcome any obstacle just by trying harder. Sabbath is our weekly reminder that we are saved, not by trying harder, but by letting go. We need to embrace our limits as creatures who are created for rest. There's nothing less American than thinking you can't do everything. But ceasing weekly and resting regularly means creating margin, and it means saying no to doing it all. To reject the notion that we're somehow missing out or are less valuable if we don't do everything. So it means we don't have to play piano, play basketball, swim, and be in debate. It means we don't have to sacrifice our health and our time with family and friends to earn another promotion. It means letting go of the lie that we can save ourselves. See, in Jesus Christ, we have been liberated from Pharaoh's kingdom. The cross and the empty tomb were our exodus. Jesus took the plagues onto himself and freed us from the bondage of slavery to productivity, consumption, and self-reliance. We are now liberated to work joyfully, but to stop regularly. We are now liberated to enjoy God's provision of what we need without greedily grasping for more. We are now liberated from hoarding, and we can be radically generous with our time and our energy. We are now liberated from self-reliance to embrace our Savior who invites us into his rest. Let's pray. So God, thank you for the gift of Sabbath. Thank you for freeing us. I don't know what came to mind for my sisters and brothers in the room, but Lord, whatever it is that we are still holding on to, whatever it is we feel chained by, whether it's productivity or consumption or self-reliance or all three, God, I pray that this would be an assurance, as difficult as it can be, an assurance that you are better, that life in you is fuller than our work, fuller than the things we have, the things we can purchase, fuller than our own strength and our own abilities. In you we find deep and true rest and peace, that we may then be equipped to serve and love our neighbors as you've intended for us, as you've created us to be. To be ones who get to liberate others out of our own freedom, to liberate the land, to liberate those who are oppressed, those who are vulnerable, those who are beaten down. We get to stand up for them when we see that we are freed. So thank you for the cross. Thank you for the empty tomb. Thank you for our exodus. Amen.